Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening for this virtual launch of Blood in the Face. My name's Jean Casella, and I'm joined by David Neiwert and Rick Perlstein. That's Rick, not Judith Cohen. And I'm really pleased to be able to welcome them here to talk about this important and sadly extremely relevant book. I'm going to just get things going by talking a little bit about the history of the book and James Ridgeway, the late investigative reporter who wrote the book, actually wrote a much earlier edition. This edition has been 40 years in the making. Jim started covering the far right in the early 1980s. He first encountered groups like the Posse Comitatus and the revived Ku Klux Klan in the Midwest while covering the 1984 presidential election, and started to hear rumblings about, the black helicopters and the government plots combined with a heavy dose of nativism, racism, and anti-Semitism. And he started writing about that. He was at the Village Voice at the time, as he was for a couple of decades. And that material eventually became the first edition of Blood in the Face, which was published in 1990. I met Jim because I was the editor at the small sort of lefty publisher that published the original edition of Blood in the Face. This second edition originated when Trump was running for president, and took several years to complete. It's about 50% new material. The history remains, and even that's been updated. And then there are several new chapters at the end, bringing things up to the first Trump presidency. We really are sad that Jim isn't here to help inform us about this return to hell that we're experiencing now. But we have his book, which took a couple of years to get edited and published, but we're happy it's here now. I'm going to stop there. I'll say one more thing. I think that part of the importance of this book is to show how, past really is prologue in the United States. One thing that comes to mind is the Alien Enemies Act, which Trump is now using to deport Venezuelans to El Salvador, and is obviously increasingly going to use to import anyone who dissents from his policies. That dates back to the 1790s and was basically pioneered by Alexander Hamilton. So don't believe everything you hear in the musical about how pro-immigrant Hamilton was. He wanted these Alien and Sedition Acts passed because he was afraid of too many revolutionary French people coming over and, messing up our not very revolutionary new democracy. So there are many incidences like that in the book, which I'm sure will come up more as we go along. But I want to pass it off now to Rick Perlstein.
Thanks, Gene. I'm delighted to be here. I hadn't quite realized how important Jim Ridgeway was in my own vocation until I, read this new edition and thought back to when I started getting interested in the subject of the right and the far right. I was a journalist in New York, very involved in academic stuff. I mean, if it wasn't Foucault and Derrida, I didn't want to hear about it, And then the 1994 election happened, and I became, just really curious and riveted by what happened. And then, I'd always listened to talk radio as kind of like a perverse kind of, almost like voyeurism. And I started again after the 1994 election. And by the time the Oklahoma City bombing happened on April 19th, 1995, I wasn't really all that shocked because of the rhetoric I was hearing. And so I was in New York, and Ridgeway was a weekly columnist in the Village Voice. And I realized that had I not had that week by week work going through my brain about this militia movement, as we called it then, I probably wouldn't have become galvanized in the way I did. And one of the first big articles I did, feature articles in a magazine, was about scholars who were writing about the far right. And one of the things that really came across to me was, as I think David can attest, this can be very scary and dangerous work. You know, a scholar who I interviewed talked about how the first time he met, you know, I think it might have been someone from the order or something like that, the guy showed off a picture of a severed head, you know. And as I've come to appreciate, Jim Ridgeway was, you know, a reporter's reporter, right? And Gene, hearing you say that, you know, he was just, you know, traveling around in the Midwest in 1984 writing about the presidential election. Well, there were a lot of reporters traveling around the Midwest writing about the presidential election, but no one else was kind of getting deep enough and picking up the kind of echoes and signals enough to know that something much deeper was going on than what Ronald Reagan was up to, right? And, you know, kind of much later in my career, my last book, when I was researching the 1980 election, it was kind of this, long story short, it was this kind of movement where there was kind of a window for a little bit more venturesome reporting, and Ridgeway and his partner Alex Coburn had a regular series in which they traveled around the country writing about politics in the 1980 election. And, you know, he went to, just to take one example, a Florida state Republican convention. And again, lots and lots of reporters from all different mainstream media outlets would have been writing about that. But he was the only one who said, wow, these people are talking about things like the Trilateral Commission. You know, they're talking about, you know, very weird conspiracy theories that, you know, supposedly the right got rid of when, you know, William F. Buckley supposedly kicked the John Birch Society out of the conservative movement. So this was a guy who always had his ear to the ground and was not stymied by this kind of consensus ideology, which holds that, you know, American politics happens in this civilized, narrow band in the center of the political spectrum. That, you know, America is a lot wilder and whirlier and scarier than, you know, the sentimental narratives that we grew up hearing about will allow. So, you know, just revisiting this stuff and revisiting him, I think what really did, struck me was, you know, this historical section that he did on what was going on 100 years ago, exactly 100 years ago. I'll just end with one, you know, kind of final thought. I was in New York a few months ago between the period of the presidential election and the inauguration, and I decided to go to Ellis Island. And I'm old enough to remember that Ellis Island, around the time of the Statue of Liberty, was rehabbed and reopened as a museum. Like, I think it was like 1987. And the same museum, you know, was kind of still around then. And the story it tells about immigration during the Reagan era was very warm and positive. You know, there was just the idea that our civic religion is about welcoming immigrants. And the story that really stuck with me from the museum was that, you know, they kept on passing slightly more restrictive laws, right, as the 20th century advanced, until, you know, immigration was almost entirely shut down in 1924. And one of them was passed around like 1912 or 1910 or something like that. You had to have $25 in order to be allowed into the country. And you pick up a phone in the museum and you hear these people kind of doing oral histories. Like someone who worked there was saying, oh yeah, they would just pass the same $25, you know, down the line, so everyone could, you know, claim to have $25. And, you know, he was just kind of laughing about it. And that was the kind of welcoming attitude that was shared even by, you know, for various reasons, you know, Ronald Reagan and the people around him. So the devolution we've suffered since then, and the return to this kind of century-old nativism, you know, I don't think we can really quite appreciate it in the same way without these writers and scholars like Jim and like David, who, you know, dared almost to get beyond, again, those sentimental, celebratory narratives about America, and, you know, just were really willing to dive down into the dangerous and scary muck and tell the real story. So I'm very grateful that this book is back in print. It's an outstanding compendium. You can almost use it as kind of like an encyclopedia. Next time you hear about some crazy person, like whether it's, Steve Bannon or Milo Yiannopoulos or Breitbart or any of them, just look in the index and it's all right there. So definitely 2 thumbs up from me.
David, I think you're muted.
Yes, I'm on now. Thanks for having me, everyone. A similar experience. I actually, Blood in the Face, I would say, was the second book that I got that turned me, it was part of my turn towards treating right-wing extremism as a beat in the early 90s. I decided to make it my beat, actually about mid-90s. And the first book was actually The Silent Brotherhood by Gary Gerhardt and what's his name, the second guy? Anyway, the book about the order. And as it happened, I knew the order. I was the editor of the little daily paper in Sandpoint, Idaho in the late 70s, Sandpoint Daily B. And I used to get letters to the editor from Robbie Matthews, the leader of the order. And we were acutely aware of him. But I and my boss, I was all 21 at the time, maybe 22 at the time we made this decision. We thought that, these guys just want attention, and we're not going to give it to them. So we thought we were made what we thought was the astute decision not to cover them. This was in, I would say, early '79 that I and the publisher came to this decision. We were going to mute the Aryan Nations because we weren't going to give them the oxygen that they wanted. And boy, was that a stupid mistake. Because within a couple of years, the whole region was just awash in all these hate crimes from all these people moving up to the Panhandle and Western Montana and Eastern Washington and committing all these hate crimes. And it culminated in '84 with the order and their rampage. This was a guy named Robert Matthews who moved up from Arizona. And of course, this is, I think, one of the sort of essential stories in Blood in the Face, partly because that happened in '84, of course, the year that he was covering the election. And there were all kinds of, he knew about Gordon Call and all the Posse Comitatus stuff that we were seeing a fair amount of in the Northwest. And if you were covering this stuff as a reporter, you knew this stuff was going on. But we were, tried to be judicious about how we reported on it because we didn't want to give them free publicity. And, it was a big lesson that, these guys thrive in darkness. They fester in darkness. If you want to deal with them in your community, you need to shine a very bright light on them and keep that light focused on them, because then they scatter. So in the '90s, when I was really first starting to freelance, because I'd been in newsroom work all those in the years before that. But I decided, I can kind of see the direction media was going, and I went, well, I need to start writing my own stuff. So I started freelancing then, and I decided, I basically wound up doing 2 stories as my 2 different sort of tracks as my primary journalism output, and one was writing about killer whales because I was an environmental reporter, but had an investigative background, and so I started writing about killer whales as kind of the consummate Pacific Northwest outdoors or environmental story. But then I also started writing about militias that were organizing as an anti-environmental backlash story that was happening in the Northwest. We had the militia Montana folks organizing out here, and it was all the same stuff. And fortunately, and I did have this background. I grew up in southeastern Idaho, a non-Mormon among a heavily Mormon culture. I think 72% of my graduating class was LDS. But they had this whole culture in the 60s, especially, of John Bircherism. We were just awash in conspiracism. So all this stuff that I was hearing about, even into the 90s about the constitutionalism and the stuff that the kind of conspiracy theories that the posse comitatus types were hawking and selling, and then who the militia types were selling. This is all very familiar stuff to me because it was conspiracy theories I'd grown up with. So it was really easy for me to sort of dive into this stuff because I knew the subject. And yeah, but the thing about Jim's book that he made really clear, I had this really fairly regionally oriented background, and Jim's book gave me a very expansive view of where this stuff was coming from, how long it had been around, and what its origins were. And so I began doing the historical research. It actually tied in with, I had been doing a long project about the Japanese American internment during the 90s, which I eventually wrote a book about called Strawberry Days. But and there actually is a huge crossover between the Japanese American internment and this stuff, because it was all built around these conspiracy theories that were drummed up by these far right nativists who operating between 1900 and 1942, who created this whole mythology about these Japanese farmers that had come to the West Coast beginning really in 1890. And so I did, I had this background dealing with that, but you could see, the huge connection between their conspiracism and their nativism and what the Ku Klux Klan was doing, because of course the Klan was also very much in favor of the internment, but they were out of the picture by then. But it was a lot of the same actors, a lot of the same people were involved, and certainly a lot of the same sort of conspiracism. So and Jim's book, because it had all this history in it, really tied everything together for me and enabled me to kind of start looking forward to, well, so where are we going with this? And when I started blogging in 2003, that was kind of the subject of my blog. I was talking, really, the focus of it was writing about how right-wing extremism was invading the mainstream and was seeping its way into the mainstream, because I could see it happening in the 90s, but back then it was a distinct thing. And but here's the thing: people don't think about this, but what we called the militia movement, they called the Patriot movement, and it has been called the Patriot movement since the 90s, into the 2000s, and into the Tea Party era, when it essentially took over the Tea Party. And then when Donald Trump came along, he started calling all of his followers patriots. And this was, the Patriot movement is MAGA, and MAGA is the Patriot movement. It's basically what MAGA is now the remnants of, or what the evolution of the old militia movement. And I don't think people appreciate that or understand it, but that's actually what we're dealing with, what we've been dealing with since 2015. And I happen to have that background that let me identify that right away. So,
in the original edition of Blood in the Face, the 1990 edition, ended with this kind of warning or cautionary tale, in which Jim said, the fringe is becoming the fabric particularly the fabric of the mainstream Republican Party. And we've seen that just come to its ultimate fruition now. And I wonder, Rick, as a historian of the Republican Party, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I want to maybe start answering that question with a question for you, Gene, which is how, when this book came out in 1990, was it received? Was it just like, why are you bothering with these lunatics who don't have anything to do with anything?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, there were many death threats, and thank God there was, not social media and things like that back then. So Jim couldn't be canceled, but he got lots of calls, and so certainly the far right itself, although there were members of the far right who were happy to, become more notorious as a result of his book. There was also a film called Blood in the Face that came out in 1991 to accompany the first edition of the book. And that film was sold to PBS, for example, and PBS decided not to show it because they didn't want to amplify. And this is, something that you brought up, David, about in your early career, this question of, do you want to amplify and give credence to these thoughts and beliefs, or do you want to, not cover them? And Jim was always a big believer in shining the light, and, the first thing you have to do is open your eyes if you want to fight back. So, there was some pushback even then. And also, yes, there was some reception of this as, why give all this space to these kooky fringe elements? And both the original edition and the new edition, reproduce writing from inside the movements, these zines, and now everything's online, of course, but, them in their own words. So you can really see both the craziness and then, sick internal logic of it. And I also think something that he always argued that, is very clear is that it's never just about anti-government. There's always the nativist element, the racist element, and a shocking amount of anti-Semitism behind so much of this anti-government stuff. It's like you peel the onion down a couple of layers, and there it always is.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of my answer to the question is it's a really complicated subject. It's just no easy answers because, yes, on the one hand, it's very easy to come across, someone on the right where, I like to point out that right-wing politics is just inherently Jansenist, right? Because everyone knows, maybe kind of, since the Holocaust, let's say, that hardcore anti-Semitism, explicit anti-Semitism is kind of self-canceling for someone who wants any serious attention in the political arena, right? So there's just this ongoing, example after example after example of, people who, put on a bright, happy face, that they show outward to the public, but then to this esoteric inside group, they quote unquote speak the truth, right? And, so many of the stars of this story are stars of the story because they manage this skillfully, whether it's Pat Buchanan, who, to his dying day was on MSNBC almost every day, even though he was talking about how great the Nazis were, and when he ran for president in 2000, or David Duke, whose whole skill, was, on the one hand, he was a guy who, was talking about white power and biological racism, and then put on a suit and smiled and said, hey, I can, become a viable Senate candidate. Was it Senate, David, in 1990 in Louisiana by, talking like Ronald Reagan, right? So and then, for people who are trying to fight this kind of politics, it doesn't really help you in public to just say, oh, they're just a bunch of Nazis, right? So, kind of threading all those needles can be very, very complicated. I mean, a final thought about that is the trope that is so powerful on the right is this idea of this very simple word, truth, the truth, right? So, we have Truth Social. Literally Vivek Ramaswamy's book is called Truth, So there's all these people who, fetishize this word truth and say, Donald Trump is so truthful, he's so honest. And, those of us who are like, what are you talking about? He demonstrably lies every single day. But truth is kind of like this code word of this person who really understands that deep down underneath, it's the white republic against the mud people, right? And so the challenge of kind of decoding this kind of language is so powerful. And the smartest people in this world are the ones who almost treat language kind of like a diamond with all these facets, and it kind of glints differently depending on which direction the light sheds from. And the fact that the people who are kind of most quote unquote courageous, right? So there's a word, like, why aren't more Republicans in Congress brave enough, to stand up to Donald Trump? Well, a lot of them think that they're very brave by going along with Donald Trump, because that means they have the courage not to, surrender the quote unquote truth to, this fallen liberal world, right? So the way language is used is kind of fundamentally different. And, one of the things, one of my favorite things by David, but it's all over Blood in the Face too, is, a series of articles, essays he wrote about how skillfully Rush Limbaugh, launders stuff that you used to only be able to hear on shortwave radio, right, in the 80s by Posse Comitatus people, and was putting it out to 10, 20 million people a day, by the 1990s on AM radio. And now, of course, it's in the White House. And the people who are always the most admired in this world are the people who explicitly say what other people only say in code.
Right. It used to be dog whistle, and now you don't need the dog whistle anymore. You can come right out and say it.
Right. Although there's still a lot of dog whistling. It's like I'm, one of these congressional staffers on the right turns out to have a, secret code name, like one of the guys in Doge, I think, was, saying, you couldn't pay me enough to, marry someone outside my ethnic group, under a, code name. So there's still dog whistles.
Yeah.
A lot less.
No, that's very true. Yeah, I want to say that we are very happy to take questions from those of you who are listening. So please go ahead and write those out, and they will get to us. And also, I think, everyone I know probably comes to something like this thinking, well, what can we do about this now that they have ascended to the White House and, are running everything? What does history teach us anything about how we can react to this? And I mean, I will say that, one of the arguments that Jim makes in the book is that a lot of this stuff is emotional cover for the, Heritage Foundation Republican Party to go ahead and do everything they always dreamed of doing. And we do see that happening now. And also that, a long time ago in our history, there was, success at dividing the working class along racial and ethnic lines to prevent the kind of class solidarity. So the people now identify with their tribe rather than their class. And he thought that was a sort of essential component of where we ended up today with the working class voting Republican. So I wonder if you guys or any of you who are listening have thoughts about that.
Did you want to say something, David?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I mean, clearly the whole use of race to divide working people by class has been around. I mean, that was clearly what was going on in the early 1900s when the nativists were, dividing people, especially working class people, from, trying to keep unions from gaining ground. And a lot of course, we remember that a lot of what the fascists were about was countering socialists and communists from organizing and preventing them from organizing workers. And that was why so many industrialists backed Hitler, as they saw him as a buffer. And that was clearly something that was going on in the US. That was part of why Henry Ford was this great progenitor of the protocols of the Seven Elders of Zion, this, the conspiracy theory, anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Ford was the guy who actually inspired Hitler to pick that up. Ford, and he distributed it all throughout the States. And so in the 1920s, when the Klan actually controlled much of the country, they controlled legislatures in states like Indiana and Oregon, and they had millions of members all across the country. And they were seen as basically a sort of chamber of commerce thing. And, it was good government, and we were going to practice good eugenics, And they used all those racial things as a way of defanging the union movement, the labor movement. And that was a lot of what they were actually directing it against. And Jim was one of the first journalists who really picked up on that, I think, as well.
I definitely have, I've been giving two answers to people who say, kind of what can we do kind of stuff. And one is people are kind of in this incredibly fraught movement are receiving kind of opportunities every day to make kind of very deep decisions, kind of like existentialist novel kind of decisions about whether to keep your head down, right, and just kind of stay safe, or make yourself seen and felt and put something in the way of these people. Because, it's really easy for something bad to happen when no one stands in the way. And I'm just speaking as a Chicagoan, when Homan from ICE, decided Chicago was the first place he was going to go to start, scooping up migrants, the city was extremely well organized, right? We all went to meetings. We all learned exactly what to say, exactly what to do, exactly what to tell people, that they didn't have to open the door, that they didn't have to say anything, that they didn't have to go anywhere, that they needed a warrant for this and they needed a warrant for that. And of course, ultimately, they can just kick down your door and that's the next step. But the fact of the matter is, Homan went on CNN and said, these people in Chicago are too well trained, so we just kind of left and moved on to the next city. This is why AOC is, under threat, because she's saying these are your constitutional rights, right? You don't have to open your door unless there's a warrant. So you'll get lots of opportunities. You could be like Columbia University or whatever that law firm was, or you can be like the people that we celebrate in history because, they were the people who said, no, not in my name, right? I mean, we're kind of living in big history right now. The other thing is, and, I don't know if, what, I think Haymarket is probably a 501c3, but I'm not a 501c3. Unfortunately, there are only two political parties that are on the ballot in America because of the way the laws are set up. One of them is fascist and one of them isn't, right? And you just have to participate in the one party we have that's not fascist, because, if radicals do it, if non-neoliberal sellouts, get involved in democratic politics, that means that the neoliberal sellouts are, crowded out. And especially at a moment in which there's just this mass discontent with the leadership, the superannuated gerontocracy running the Democratic Party, showing up at a Democratic meeting right now, Democratic Party meeting, can have a lot of effect. I'm in my ward organization, and we decide who the candidates are going to be. So, it's a great time to get involved, not just in protest politics, which is very important, but also partisan politics.
I just want to thank you. I want to call everyone's attention to a couple of the questions that have come in. What do you think is the best way to counter the conspiracy theories of the right is one question. And the other is, can you explain the groups who are fascist today? Unfortunately, they're kind of running the country. But beyond that, what are the constituent? Maybe, David, you could take that question.
Sure, I could definitely answer the second question, probably the first one as well. But the second question, when we talk about actual fascist organizations, they range from the Proud Boys, who are a clearly brown shirt style street thug organization in the tradition of the SA and the black shirts. And classically proto-fascist in all their attitudes and outlooks. The only thing they don't do is go on about rounding people up into camps, but I'm sure that's coming. And outfits like the Oath Keepers, who try to provide a sort of paramilitary presence for Donald Trump and his followers, for the MAGA movement. And then you have people like Nick Fuentes and, the overt white nationalists. His is called America First. They held an annual conference, and they're just nakedly white nationalists. I mean, they don't, and openly anti-Semitic too, I might add. And then we have a number of others that are what I would call sort of para-fascist or pseudo-fascist. They're right on the border of being openly fascist, and including like Turning Point USA, people like that. And what they all are profoundly is deeply authoritarian, and they're really urging and promoting an authoritarian politics, and they're leaning into the appeal to authoritarian personalities that all of these movements have. So.
And the other question, what's the best way to counter the conspiracy theories of the right, Rick?
Yeah, I mean, the conspiracy theories are so cunning and dangerous because they're so all-consuming, right? And you can argue with someone about the contradictions in what they believe until you're blue in the face, right? I mean, the classic conspiracy theory is that Jews are the bankers running Germany, and they're also the communists who are destroying Germany, right? Well, they can't be true at the same time. So the way I think of it is, a lot of what it's like to be in the Republican Party and supporting Donald Trump right now, and this is nothing original with me, is it really is like, a cult-like formation, right? And one surrenders to a cult because one is looking for easy answers and one wants to salve the anxieties of everyday life. And there really is kind of like a very narrow membrane between, being over here and the regular reality where things are messy and there are no easy answers. And then there's this membrane, and then you just kind of go over into here, and then suddenly you have all these answers, and you're just, putty in their hands, right? And I think it's really important to kind of find the people who are kind of near the middle of that, right? And again, once again, show up. It's like if you have people in your life, don't try and argue with them, but just humanize yourself, right? David and I have a mutual friend named Sarah Robinson, who was and probably is very big on, just being in rural spaces and saying liberals are people like just like you and me, right? It's like, everyone's leaving Twitter. I don't leave Twitter. I just kind of like because there's so many people on Twitter, it's kind of like what David said, right? When him and his newspaper publisher were like, well, if we ignore them, we won't be giving them attention, right? Well, if you leave Twitter and don't argue with people, then they think that, someone who's in that middle realm will think that the only logic, the only truth exists on this side, on the cult side of the question. So, I have a dear grade school friend, who, on my Facebook page was clearly becoming kind of, Trump curious. He started out kind of being annoyed at, how messy and angry politics were. And, when I did a post saying, hey guys, we're trying this thing where we're not, going to buy anything on, March 29th or whatever it was. I don't know if that was a good idea for a protest or a bad idea for a protest. But my point is that this old friend of mine, this very, very sweet guy who I adored, always adored since 8th grade, made a joke. He said, I'm just going to buy everything I can that day. And I just, slipped into his DMs and said, hey, look at this, look at this, look at this. And then another time, he said, when I criticized Doge, he's like, well, in my job, I get audited, And so again, I slipped into his DMs and said, well, if they fire all the, tax collectors, how does that make the government more efficient? A lot of it is just kind of reaching people on a very intimate and human level, right? And requires a mode of address that maybe, combativeness has its role, and I can be extremely combative, but maybe is a little less combative than, kind of your instinct, kind of dictates you. But I think, just finding people who are just, kind of like on the edge of moving from the scary real world to the supposedly safe, kind of conspiracy world. And, it's like they're so good. They're so good at, Steve Bannon is so good at this, love bombing vulnerable people and saying, over here it's safe, right? Well, we got to be able to look people in the eye and say, no, over here it's safe. I got your back. It's all very abstract what I'm saying, but hopefully I'm kind of communicating something useful.
Yeah, and I think that's something the left is really bad at.
Right. No, like, oh, I agree with you on 20 things, but I agree with you on this 21st thing. So, you're a fascist. No,
right.
That's no circular firing squad.
Happens a lot.
Yeah.
Academic
distinctions when they line us up against the wall, liberals, radicals, they hate us all.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing is that they're so, and this actually helps, I think, explain the question we just got, which is why are people so spineless on our side? Because we actually have a sort of reflexive thing to avoid conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, people ask me what to do. I mean, some of it you do have to watch out for your own, protect yourself. You can't just dive into these harried situations where guys can be screaming in your face and you're never going to get anywhere. There's no point in even engaging in that kind of stuff. But if you can have a normal conversation with people who have fallen down these rabbit holes, you at least have a chance of persuading them that we're not all evil. I mean, as you know, Rick, I recorded when I was working for Crooks and Liars. My job was to record Fox every day and pull clips from it. And it just really struck me over the years why how they would create this demonized version of what a liberal is.
Yeah.
That was just totally unrecognizable. And yet this is what a regular Fox viewer, I realized, because I have people in my own family that were watching Fox News all the time. And it created this idea in their heads that, that I hate, that all of us who are liberals, we all hate America. We all hate people.
We all hate them.
We all hate them. We have nothing but contempt for them. And of course, this is something that was the essence of Limbaugh's shtick, of course. That was what Limbaugh told people beginning in the early 90s, is that those liberals hate you. Alex Jones has been telling people this for years as well. And that's the thing, is that I think you have a chance, at least, if you can convince somebody who's a dedicated Fox watcher that no, we're not all a bunch of satanic assholes who want to, we perform abortions 2 hours after birth, right? Which is what Trump and people have been saying, things like that. And so that's, I think, really key here, but also, to actually engage. I mean, ultimately, I would say that the one thing that I've been doing, especially since I retired, but even before then, or retired from daily reportage, was that, and I've been kind of focusing on it just in my daily life, is to, if I want to be the antithesis of fascism, I need to be generous and kind, because they are the antithesis of kindness and generosity.
So a lot of Democrats confuse, generosity and kindness with spinelessness, right? And it's a real paradox, right? It's like our ethics is tolerance, but what happens when you tolerate someone who's intolerant, right? It's literally this philosopher Karl Popper, the Popper's paradox, right? I mean, with the spinelessness issue, it's like there are just so many spineless Democrats, right? There's nothing we can do to kind of make this generation of Democrats not spineless. I mean, literally, in an interview recently, Chuck Schumer said that Donald Trump weaved a spell over the Republican Party, and when he goes away, it'll go back to the way it was, right? I mean, it's just, they're demented people, right? So, to me, the answer to how do you deal with spineless Democrats is, people who are not spineless have to be Democratic activists and not say the Democrats are so fallen and corrupt that I don't want to have anything to do with them, right? I mean, that's just surrendering.
Yeah, I think there's also a political angle or a problem there too, in that there's so many people who run as Democrats who think they have to
reach out.
They feel like they have to mediate and ameliorate their own positions constantly in order to be appealing to this great middle of the voters. And my argument has always been that, no, actually, this great middle of voters is sitting there and judging you, and they can tell whether you're spineless or not.
No, that's
if you don't stand up for the principles of what you believe, if you don't defend transgender people, not because you have this woke idea of defending transgender people, but because you believe in a democracy where all people are welcome and have a place, and if you can't talk about that, if you can't explain why you support these people who are being demonized and attacked in right-wing attacks, if you can't explain that, then you really don't belong in politics in the first place.
Right. I think there's a kind of another one of these paradoxes is, since the Republicans are such assholes and so aggressive and so violent tempered, well, you have to be the opposite of that. You have to be mild, right? And that's just a one of the things we used to talk about a lot back in the old blogosphere days, David, is there was lots of polls showing that people voted for George W. Bush, even though they disagreed with every policy position he had, because they said, well, he really seems to believe, in his gut, that he's right. And the other guy, He's so wishy-washy, right?
Right.
I mean, it's just a question of respect. I mean, why would you respect someone who doesn't seem to have the courage of their convictions, right? So, when you meet a Republican halfway, that often just makes it easier for the Republican to spit on you. Right. When you reach out the hand of fellowship, it becomes really easy for the Republican to just, smash your hand, right?
I think of how Trump would grabs people and pulls them towards them when he does his handshakes with
and all we need to do is see how many people are hungry for Democrats with backbones.
Right.
See, Bernie and AOC getting 30,000 people in Denver, right. The biggest political crowd in the history of the city, And, Chuck Schumer has to, cancel his book tour because no one wants to have anything to do with him, So, but if you have a spine, well, maybe the Democrats need you.
We have a question saying, how close do you think we are to an outright fascist takeover? And another question earlier that I thought was interesting about the direct overlap of the far right and some of the richest people in the country. Is that a new development?
Oh, no. Tell them about H.L. Hunt, right?
Yeah, and not to mention Henry Ford.
Yeah, Henry Ford. I mean, H.L. Hunt was an oil wildcatter who was famous in the 50s as the richest man in America. And he was basically the funder of all the far-right racist organizations. He wrote a speculative novel in which he proposed that the number of votes you got was based on how much money you had, right? So it's always been the Mercers. It's like the most extreme people are often these right-wing super zillionaires because it they get seized by this narcissism that they're kind of this kind of aristocratic class that everyone has to bow down to.
Yeah. Elon Musk is just the latest iteration of that. We've seen these kind of ultra rich people for a very long time. I mean, Fritz Thiessen. Think of Fritz Thiessen. He basically he was the guy behind all the German armaments. And he was, he and the steelmaker Farben were making a lot of the weapons for, were responsible for manufacturing much of the German war machine. And of course he was a big supporter of Hitler's, but within about 4 years he was under house arrest.
I saw someone asked about was that question was it kind of the Reagan era that kind of led the Democrats to kind of give up on the courage of their convictions? I think the Reagan victory in 1980 was really traumatizing, and a lot of the people who became the biggest kind of trimmers and triangulators were people who lost in that election. Bill Clinton lost the Arkansas governor's race in 1980. Joe Lieberman lost his race for attorney general. And I think it was really kind of came out of nowhere because people, the discourse, the rhetoric was that Reagan was crazy and no one was going to vote for him. And when Reagan won a landslide, it just really broke a lot of people's brains. And the Democrats are still kind of recovering from that. And that's why it's so important, to kind of replace the kind of, bad generation of Democrats with a new, younger generation of Democrats. I'm a very strong believer in that. It's like half the time I'm really glad I'm not writing as much anymore because I think, I'm ready to kind of hand it over to people who are actually building their lives and have a much stronger sense of, where the pressure points are,
Yeah, I'm not, I'm glad to be retired, partly because I was, for 5 years, was out covering this stuff on the street. I was in the middle of about 20 different Proud Boys rallies and things like that. And I just don't need that kind of violence in my life. So, but I do have a lot of fear and dread of what's coming if these guys start doing their stochastic terrorism thing.
Yeah.
And we've already seen it, of course, to some extent with, I was going to mention this earlier, that, the people who tried to, you were talking about how in Chicago, they prepared for the Hohman people to do the immigrant pickups, do these immigrant sweeps. Well, even before then, we had a situation here in Western Washington where a local elementary school held an event that was designed to inform immigrants of their constitutional rights, and it was all about, here's how you can prepare for what's coming, and it was it was a public thing. Libs of TikTok got a hold of this, and they wound up shutting the thing down because they were just swarmed with all these threats. And basically it got depicted as they're teaching them how to evade ICE, and how to avoid the law. Which is of course what these nativists do. And I really think, and this sort of gets back to how we defend each other. If we're going to defend each other, first of all, we have to link arms, and this kind of event is one of the ways we link arms. But then when we link arms, we can't get scared. We can't let them scare us off.
Well,
and of course,
scaring is natural, but we just have to face our fears, and
yeah,
like all the great heroes of history have.
Yeah, and it's easy to convince people who understand the moment. It's not easy to convince people who don't recognize the moment, particularly if they're administrators in the local school districts, or they're people who are just like suddenly flabbergasted that this mob is descending on them, and freak out and flip switches. Rather than understanding, no, this is an important moment where we all have to stand up and face these people down. And ultimately, that's what it takes. I don't think, it's going to, somebody asked earlier, how close are we to a fascist movement? And I think sometimes when I see this stuff happening, I think we may be closer than we think. I think certainly we're very close when we see Tom Homan threatening AOC. I think if they start arresting people who stand up to them, and particularly prominent figures like AOC and Bernie and people like that, I think all bets are off.
Yeah, to me, the extent to which we're really close to a kind of a fascist reality is the amount of people who accept a haze of unreality as reality, right? To me, it's, yes, the physical stuff, the violent stuff is really important. The administrative stuff is really important. The legal stuff is really important. But when your neighbor thinks that, Elon Musk is a super genius who knows how to fix the U.S. government, that's insane. That's ridiculous. But, lots more people believe that than are, willing to, smack someone across the face who defends an immigrant. And that's, to me, what is really scary, because then you get into the dark realm of online algorithms, and the fact that, as I point out, any fascist lie that Elon Musk decides is a truth, or he's going to pretend is the truth, and he puts on Twitter, is going to be seen in front of more people's eyes than any sentence I ever write in my life, right? And to me, that's the most fascist thing we're dealing with right now.
Just returning to historical context, and that the book traces. One thing you see when you read the whole thing through is that this stuff has to some extent been cyclical, and whenever progress is made in terms of racial justice or, class justice, beginning with, let's say, Reconstruction, there's always been a backlash, and sometimes a really powerful backlash. Yeah. And, we've been talking about the 1920s when there were tens of thousands of people in their Klan robes marching down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. And, Anaheim was called Klanaheim because everybody had Klan barbecues every weekend. And there was, a terribly oppressive anti-immigration bill passed in, was it 1924? That, among other things, prevented, we don't know how many Jews from escaping the Holocaust and coming to the United States. So.
Yeah, one of the problems is that whenever there's a progressive breakthrough, like think about how people felt when, Obama was elected, something in a lot of people's memory, there's this kind of sense that the work is done. I write about this a lot in my books, there was this Time magazine, said that American women were the man of the year in like 1976 or 5 or something like that. And I loved this quote in which they're like, the feminism is so universally accepted that, it's just, there's no way anything can happen, and Phyllis Schlafly, kind of came out like a Scirocco, the next year and just completely out-organized the left and beat the ERA. So, just being aware that, progress brings a backlash would be a lot of progress, because we just do this again and again and again. I remember when, Bill Clinton was elected in 1992, and I was in graduate school, and my advisor said, she's a baby boomer, and she said, "Oh, Rick, I feel like just like it was when Kennedy was elected," and just this everyone wants to kind of declare the, sort of the final victory of what is just fundamentally American. These deeply seated, dark, vicious, bigoted parts of our history. But luckily we have other resources in our history, and we have to kind of call on those. We have to achieve our country, as James Baldwin said.
Yeah, I don't think it's I don't think there's anyone questions now that the Trump presidency is a reaction to the Obama presidency. Was the backlash to the Obama presidency, and they're still getting revenge for it. I mean, they still talk about it. You go and listen to Trump's crowds, and they still bring up Obama and the Obama years as they can never tell you exactly what was so bad about Obama's presidency, just like they can't really tell you what was so bad about Biden's presidency. Oh, well, he opened the borders. Yeah, no.
Or Kennedy's presidency or Roosevelt's presidency. I mean, it's kind of depressing how predictable this stuff is. But resistance also is a effect of backlash, and like I say, we have a lot of heroic stuff to draw on. I'm really struck by something I read once. I read someone who said that the greatest thing Martin Luther King ever accomplished was that he taught Black people in the South that actually when you get beaten up, you don't die, and it's not as scary as you might have thought it might be. And once they realized that, and people started putting their bodies in the streets, they broke the back of a lot of stuff. Not everything, but a lot of this will be putting, our bodies on the line. And the more people who are willing to do it, the less far they're going to be able to get.
Yeah, I think we have to be prepared for the stochastic terrorism. We have to be able to organize against it, because they are going to be doing things where they're identifying targets and broadcasting their names and broadcasting the targets on air and urging people to do stuff to counter them. And I don't, obviously it's going to be important to not let that succeed, because that is how they succeed. That's how they win, and by scaring everybody, by frightening everybody into submission, and that's why they do this style of politics, the constant bellicose screaming in people's faces and that sort of thing, it's really transformed American politics. I mean, there are certain things that have happened in the Trump years that, genie's gotten out of the bottle that I don't know we'll ever put back, and particularly in terms of counting the elections, counting the votes. I don't think we'll ever have, since 2020, I don't think we're going to have any future election that I can think of where counting of votes isn't going to be a central issue, especially, honestly, in the 2024 election, I think there's a very possible likelihood that, these guys actually did somehow manage to manipulate the votes. I mostly say that because
right?
Yeah. I mostly say that because they're clearly acting now like they don't think they're going to have to face the voters again. This just raises all kinds of suspicions for me. There's just way too much hinky behavior around, not just around the election itself, but around how they're behaving now. They clearly don't seem to think that they're going to have to deal with the voters again. And that worries me.
So do you feel like this is another cycle, or is this, the beast slouching toward Bethlehem? Is this categorically different?
I mean, we've seen worse, right? I mean, the Civil War almost had 1 million people die, right? Hopefully we can, transcend without that sort of thing. But, societies have non-violently transformed themselves in very profound ways. South Africa is one example, right? Indian independence is another, right? It's quite remarkable. There's a really wonderful book by Thomas Ricks, who was the Washington Post military correspondent in Iraq. And it's about Martin Luther King as a military strategist. And he pointed out, it's fascinating stuff, because one of the things he points out is like Martin Luther King never had a protest without, some sense of what that protest was an increment towards, And we don't ever do that, right? We don't ever think about kind of what's next after this protest? How do we build power for the next protest? And, it's like, in a media society, nonviolence, putting the evil of our adversaries on display, soul force, as Martin Luther King called it, it can be incredibly powerful stuff. So, there are, like I say, lots of resources of hope that we can draw on.
That makes me think of something that Jim told me back to that 1984 presidential race, that, nobody cared about the Republican and Democratic parties in these small farming communities where he was going, where these far-right groups had so much appeal. But there were some people who were going to Jesse Jackson rallies, of all things, and relating to the message that Jackson had.
Jesse Jackson, because somehow he was treated as, sort of somehow kind of black nationalist, when everyone knew who was involved in that movement that it really was a rainbow coalition. And actually Walter Mondale did send Jesse Jackson around the country to talk about things like, farm foreclosures and the minimum wage, and he was incredibly effective.
Right.
And it's, that was kind of what scared the neoliberals in the Democratic Party. Wasn't that he was a black nationalist, but that he was actually a multicultural activist.
Right. And these were the farmers who were facing foreclosures on their farms that had been in the families for generations. And it reminds me of what you said, Rick, about an explanation for everything that's going wrong in your life. Like, you're not the failure, it's the...
That's right.
So we have to have a counter narrative to that, it's the, the Jews and the black people taking your jobs and the immigrants taking your jobs. There's got to be another story behind that, and the story behind it is obvious what it should be. But
and Chuck Schumer ain't telling that story, but maybe he is,
Well, and this gets back to what I was saying about how we just lack a spine, because we don't stand up for our actual principles. I mean, immigration's really a classic case where, you know, it's really a pretty simple thing to stand up for saying immigration's good for the country. Immigrants play a key role in making our economy work. They play a key role in building our communities, and especially they play, you know, it's really easy. You know, they shape our communities. Yes, it's going to look different because they come from different cultures, but you find ways to ameliorate that. You know, you lean into promoting immigrants, and you try to make the system so it actually works, and you don't have this huge class of people who are undocumented, which is only a product, really, of the utter failure of both Democrats and Republicans to pass comprehensive immigration reform. Because there is a solution to all this, and it's just a matter of passing laws that, you know, the Republicans go, well, oh, it's amnesty, and it's not amnesty, but we have to, you know, Democrats aren't courageous enough to lean into this stuff and push back. Instead, they go.
Meeting them halfway on immigration is just so tactically disastrous. I always point out to people, I have kind of a little jujitsu move when I get into arguments with, you know, I pick fights with people on X, you know, about this stuff. And I say, because there's so much philo-Semitism, especially on the Christian right. And I say, hey, guys, if we had the immigration policies you guys want, you know, in the early 20th century, you know, I wouldn't exist and my grandparents would have been a lampshade, you know. It's like, oh, right. And, you know, I mean, sometimes when you point out that the same things, you know, that people say now about Venezuelans are what they were saying about the Irish, you know, in the 1840s, you know, sometimes you can the scales can fall from people's eyes, you know. Not always. It's not a magic bullet. But you know, like I say, there are lots of resources of hope we have.
You know, the first chapter of Blood in the Face is called Native Americans, and it's very much about how every single generation of immigrants claimed that they were the real Americans, and that the generation that followed them, you know, were the interlopers who were going to, you know, devalue American values.
Well, Google what Benjamin Franklin had to say about the Germans.
The Germans, exactly. Rick, we're going to lose you in a moment. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any final words?
I mean, I'm really grateful for Haymarket, a great American institution, a great Chicago institution. And I'm just really proud to be fighting alongside everyone within the sound of my voice. We shall overcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much. David, any last words from you?
To go back to what you were just saying, you know, out of that first chapter about real Americans, it's certainly central to, I think, everything that I've had to deal with. And fascinatingly enough, this idea of being the real Americans is also a central component of authoritarian personalities. It's called conventionalism, and they both, you know, there are three behavioral and attitudinal clusters that form authoritarian personalities. The first is authoritarian submission to the glorious leader. The other is authoritarian aggression, which is aggression directed against people who fail to submit. And then finally, the third is conventionalism, this idea that they represent the real Americans. And it really ties in, especially with right-wing extremists. They all think of themselves as heroes. You know, it's one of the things that is in Umberto Eco's Fascism essay, as he talks about how in fascist society everyone is educated to be a hero. And that's very much true. I mean, think about what the most popular movie genre of the last 15 years has been. It's been superhero movies. We've got a society that's just primed for this stuff because everybody wants to be a friggin' hero. I mean, certainly that's true. Every right-wing extremist, especially the domestic terrorists that I wrote about, they've all seen themselves from Robbie Matthews to Timothy McVeigh to Shauna Ford to Dylan Roof. They all see themselves as heroes out to save America. And this is really central to the sort of violence that comes with right-wing extremism.
And we all know that the real heroes are the people who accept their vulnerability and see themselves as, members of a community. So right. There it is.
Right, and who form bonds with others and link up with others and take care of others. Those are the really strong people. But we've got this really perverted idea of masculinity and strength that is an outgrowth of authoritarianist movements. Yeah.
Well, I really love that, what you both said as a wrapping up point, because it's deep and hopeful. I do want to remind people that the book is available everywhere, online and in local bookstores. And if they don't have it, please ask for it. It really is important to see where we've come from, to know where we're going. And thank you so much, David and Rick, and thank you, Haymarket, for believing in this book. And thank you all for being here tonight.
Namaste, motherfuckers.
Thanks a lot, everyone.